Today I'd like to finish our studies in experimental design, so go ahead and turn into your study guides to Experimental Design 3. Now let's talk about types of experimental designs. There's two different types of experimental designs we're going to cover here, and the first one is a completely randomized experimental design. Now in a completely randomized experimental design, all the experimental units are allocated at random among all the different treatment groups. So we're going to take every one of our experimental units that we're imposing treatment on and randomly assign each one of these units to a specific treatment. A randomized block design goes one step further. A randomized block design, the experimental units are first blocked into homogeneous groups, much like our stratified sampling. And then once we block them off into homogeneous groups, then we randomly assign each one of those blocks to the different treatment groups. So once again, the experimental units are first blocked off into homogeneous groups, and then once those experimental units are put in those blocks, each of the experimental units within the block are randomly assigned to the different treatment groups. Now diagrams are often helpful in describing experimental designs. Let's begin with the completely randomized experimental design. Here is a diagram for a completely randomized experimental design. First we begin with our experimental units. Recall our experimental units is our explanatory variable. Now once we have the experimental units, we're going to randomly allocate those experimental units among the different treatment groups. So in this particular example, we have three different treatment groups. Once our experimental units have been allocated to those treatment groups, we're going to perform treatments on each of those individuals within the treatment groups themselves, and then we ultimately measure the response. We're going to measure the response of each treatment group and record and compare those responses. Let's consider the following completely randomized experimental design with 20 experimental units and 4 different treatment groups. So below are our 20 experimental units, and above we're going to randomly allocate each one of these experimental units into one of 4 treatment groups. Now this can be accomplished by either putting slips of paper labeled treatment A, treatment B, treatment C, and treatment D, having equal numbers of each, and having each one of the individuals draw for the treatment that they'll receive. Let's randomly assign the experimental units now to the different treatments. So the units are being randomized into different treatment groups through some type of a randomization process, whether it was slips of papers in a hat that they drew, or whether it was a random number we generated and took the lowest 1/4 of those numbers and assigned them to treatment A, the next 1/4 of those numbers to B, so forth and so on, and the highest numbers to D. So there's different ways we could allocate the individual experimental units into the different treatment groups, and this once again is a completely randomized design. Now let's talk about a randomized block experiment. Here is a diagram for a randomized block experimental design. Recall, the first thing that we want to do is we must first block our units, our experimental units, into homogeneous groups. So we want to come up with some type of commonality between the experimental units and then block them accordingly. Now in this particular randomized block experimental design, I chose 2 separate blocks. So we have our experimental units, and once again the explanatory variable is the variable that may explain or cause differences in the response. And we're going to first of all block the individuals that are doing this experiment by some type of commonality. So we're going to put this into 2 blocks. It possibly could be gender. Maybe block 1 represents males and block 2 represents females. Now once we blocked these individuals into these homogeneous groups, we're now going to randomize all the experimental units within each block to the different treatment groups. So once we have our individual experimental units within the blocks, we're going to randomize all of the units within each of the blocks here to the different treatment groups. So perhaps we still have 3 treatment groups. So the individuals are